talking about the communication factor. And when you think about getting a job, your resume and cover letter are really the first piece of that communication to an employer.
Sure.
Or maybe it's the second, I suppose. The job listing may be really that first piece. I wanted to talk about cover letters today because when I hire somebody, I almost exclusively look at the cover letter because I feel like the resume is, in my opinion, it's less flashy. You can learn a lot about the way somebody writes from a cover letter.
Right.
I don't know if I'm similar in that manner. That's just the way I look at it.
You are right. You are correct. And it's actually two sort of different styles of writing, or it should be, ideally, two different styles of writing. So the resume is going to generally be written in the third person, so it's going to sound like you're sort of in a detached way talking about yourself in the third person, whereas the cover letter, you're speaking from the I, so it's in the first person, and it's more conversational, sort of more folksy. It allows you to kind of showcase your personality a little bit. It's a place where you can tell a story about your work in a more effective way and sometimes a more impactful way.
So, yeah, and I will definitely get into the details of this, but, when I look at one, I'm like, oh, this person can either write or they can't write.
Right.
And I read somewhere a long time ago that somebody who can write can do almost anything. Good writer, it's the organized thoughts or whatnot.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about why somebody should write a cover letter other than it says in the job, please provide cover letter and resume.
And actually, it says that less often these days than it used to, for the simple fact that with the way the job market is right now, there are, companies and organizations are getting a lot more submissions. So they're asking for the cover letter less often, which in the mind of a person applying is kind of I get a lot more questions these days of should I even bother to write one? Because if it doesn't say in the job listing that you have to include one, gee, should I bother to do that? It really, and this is funny because just like anything with what I do, there's hardly ever a definitive black and white answer.
Sure.
It really does depend on your situation. I would say that in general, it's better to include one even if they don't ask for one. Just because, again, it's a venue for you to provide more information or to emphasize and sort of call out the things in your resume that you want them to pay more attention to or that you believe might be more important to the reader. So there's just, I would say in general, yes. And then another very, very common question, a follow-up question I get is, well, then how long does it have to be? If you're saying I probably should do it, do I have to keep it to one page? And again, it's you could ask 10 different people who do this for a living, and you might get different answers, right?
But we can ask Kevin for the right one.
Well, the answer is almost always it's going to be a one pager. Okay. If my opinion on it is if you can make it one page, no matter what your circumstance is, then that's probably better to do that. Just for the same reason, resumes, if you've been working for 15, 20 years, it's a lot harder to do a one-page resume and really say enough. So I have more of like a two-page max rule on a resume, whereas when it's not like a CV for an academic type position or like just a run-of-the-mill resume, two-page, try to keep it to one page in the cover letter. The only exceptions to that are going to be, okay, let's say you're a career changer or an industry changer, okay? Those are
you get the resume and you're like, this person's had 9 jobs in the last 11 years.
Right. Well, no, actually, I should have been more specific. What I'm referring to is when you are switching.
One-time change.
You could have been 15 years in the same profession. That's all you have ever done, and now you want to do something different.
So not a career or job hopper.
Right. So that clearly requires more explanation than maybe the resume itself is going to be able to provide. So even if they don't ask for a cover letter in that situation, you want to have one because you want to say, hey, I know I've been doing this for 15 years, but these are the transferable skills that I've had to use in my entire career that relate to this new thing that I want to do. Mm-hmm. And these are the things I've been successful in. And they're so close, or they're exactly the same types of things that are involved in this, or skills that are involved in this new thing I want to do. Here's that illustration. Here's the tie-in. So you use that cover letter sort of for the tie-in. But in that situation, it might be a fairly complex explanation, and it might require that you go onto a second page in the cover letter. That's a unique situation, and it's perfectly okay. If you need a little more time or room to explain your situation, you can go on to a second page in the cover letter.
Is that better than shrinking the font?
Better than shrinking the font, exactly. You want to...
I mean, truly, it's like, well, if I keep it to 1, I'm almost 2, but if I go to an 8 font...
Great question. Yeah, great question. You really want to keep it... You want to keep it scannable, and so it's going to have to... It should be 10.5 or 11-point font at a minimum. Some fonts are by nature larger appearing fonts, so you can get away with slightly smaller in terms of the font size. But as a general rule, you want to keep it that way. But another example of like what might require more than a one-page resume would be like a senior executive or someone with a very involved career, having to communicate a wide range of expertise areas, that kind of thing. Scientists and technology type professionals with very complex explanations about what they do, clearly that might require a second page. So there's always exceptions to the rule, but I would say in general you'd probably want to try to keep it to one page.
Now, most people are going to apply for a job and they're expecting some level of salary or compensation.
Right.
Do you think that people should imply or include salary information in a cover letter?
Right.
Or do you think it's a little premature?
Here's the rule of thumb, and this is also the rule of thumb for salary negotiating within an interview itself. It's kind of like he who divulges the first number loses. You know, you don't want to throw out that first number in a salary negotiation. Similar strategy with the cover letter. If they are specifically asking for, you have to include salary history, and they're not gonna. You feel like they're not gonna look at it unless you include that. Then you should probably include it. But what's funny about that is that research shows that even in those situations, they almost always will look at your stuff anyway, even if you don't feel comfortable including the salary information. So really, it's kind of a judgment. It's kind of a judgment call. But you definitely don't want to volunteer information about like what you're willing to work for unless it's specifically asked for. Mm-hmm. And then there's ways. And then the follow-up question I get to that is, okay, if I do feel like I should include salary information, if they're asking me for it, how should I include it? How should I list it? Well, there's a number of options. You can be a little strategic about it. You could say, my salary has averaged X amount over the past 5 years in the following positions.
And just make sure you bump that up about 15%.
Right, exactly. So you're giving them kind of a range or an area instead of saying like, I will not, instead of implying you will not work for a dollar less than this specific figure. Another thing you can do is do an addendum, include in a separate piece of paper your salary history, like the starting salary at each position and the ending salary at each position, so you get a little more specific and make it a little more formal in a separate sheet.
Almost easy on the eye. Like, okay,
right.
There's a little chart here, whatever,
exactly.
a spreadsheet that shows where they started, where they were at.
And that might be a situation if you have absolutely no problem divulging it and you want it to be clear and you want them to see it and you really have confidence that you're going to be able to command a certain amount.
It would seem like that would work the best, and tell me if I'm wrong. Maybe these high-level CEO jobs, the salary could be public.
Exactly.
Or maybe or maybe more like in a manufacturing sector where it's like, this is where I started and you want to show the growth.
That's very true. Yeah. And again, that's another example of like how there's very few things in this particular business that I'm in that are black and white. It's almost everything has to do with the circumstances, which ties us in with the theme today, which is the great need to ask all the right questions and communicate with my clients. I mean, I absolutely have to do that when I interview folks. I mean, I listen intently to what everybody's specific situation and need is, and then my advice that I give to them or what I do for them, I then try to base on that specific
which
situation.
Makes all the sense in the world.
Right. There's no cookie cutter situation for this stuff at all.
Not being any cookie cutter situation, I suppose, may even answer this question, but who should you send the resume to? A lot of people are. If it's on maybe Monster or Craigslist, it shows. I mean, you get an email. I suppose that's where you have to send it.
Another question that you get, because sometimes if you see if it's just a listing, like a cold listing, and it's just a response to that listing that's kind of a general response. I get this question a lot of like, most people assume they should just send it to HR. And actually, that's not really the best strategy. What you should really try to do is either address it to the highest level possible executive within that department, or really try to find out who that decision maker is. If it doesn't say, because if it does not say who you specifically should send it to in the listing, you can call HR and you can try to find out from them, or call the company and try to find out either the name of a contact or the position that would be responsible for that, because you're trying to get to that decision maker as opposed to just generically sending it to the HR department. If it's an HR position, you might be sending it to the
HR is not really
department.
hiring. I mean, HR is really gone by it's benefits and it's 401k and that's really
Exactly.
where HR lives now.
Exactly. And so that's more of like an old school thought. But these days it's much, much better. Things have become a little more specialized, and it's much better to find out that decision maker or send it to a high level manager who's actually decision maker on the job hiring.
Kevin Daniels joins us with Northwest Resumes. We have about just 30 seconds left, but any other follow-up that should be done on this type of stuff before we go to break?
Sure. I get a question a lot of like, well, I've sent my resume electronically. Should I follow it up by sending a snail mail version of the resume to make sure they receive it? If it was 10 or 15 years ago, I might say yes, but electronic, obviously in this age of the cloud and emailing.
The age of the cloud. No wonder Seattle's so popular.
Right, exactly. It's just not. It's just something that's not really necessary to do anymore. If you've sent it electronically, if that's the way they're setting up the job search, I wouldn't bother with. And so that eliminates kind of all these questions of what kind of paper should I use, because now it's like really up to the kind of paper that they have in their printer
right.
at the place, and you don't have much control over that.
Right.
If you don't have control whether they have resume paper in their printers or not. So it's just not much of an issue.
I got one final question, and we'll go. But so I love to give people samurai swords. That's my thing.
I learned that.
You did. If I was looking for a job and I wanted to send something to a hiring manager, I would send a samurai sword, because I'd say, look, I'm just trying to cut through the clutter here,
right?
And I want to get right to your desk,
right?
And you will. I mean, there's no way you're not going to read that, and there's no way you're not going to know who gave you a samurai sword.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. I honestly do.
There you go.
I honestly do.
Thanks.
There is a creative idea right there, and that's a really good example of, gee, how can I, with 50 people applying for this position, how can I set myself apart? Doing something really creative like that, especially if the job is creative.
Marketing or something.
If it was a marketing job, that would be like an unbelievably brilliant thing to do, because who else is going to do that?
Nobody.
And if they let's say they somehow didn't look at your resume before because they had 49 others. You get this sword from somebody. When I got that from you, Ben sent me a sword, by the way, just full disclosure here. It made me scratch my head. I was like wondering what's the deal. And I talked to Heather, and I got the kind of scoop from Heather. And I thought it was really interesting and cool. But like doing something like that's totally out of the box and kind of weird, frankly, it's kind of strange.
Right.
But it makes you remember.
You'll never forget who gave you a samurai sword.
Exactly. So doing extra creative things like that beyond the resume and the cover letter in this job market today, I would highly recommend.